All right, so let's go over kind of an introduction to CSS. There's really not an easy way that we can begin to dip our toes into this. We kind of jump into it. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and essentially this is a list of rules that works with our HTML to define how we want the HTML to be presented in the web browser. So essentially, how do we want it to look? We've talked over and over about how the HTML is kind of the skeleton or the bones of our website, and the CSS is the skin. So a CSS rule consists of two parts. One is the selector, which is identifying what part of the HTML element we want to change. And then the declaration block, which tells the web browser how do we want that HTML element to look. And one thing we're going to go over is this idea that each HTML element is inside of an invisible box, essentially. And the CSS is the rules about how do we control the box and how do we control the contents that are inside of this invisible box. So let's start with at the top. Let's get into what a rule is and what it looks like. So constructing a rule. Here's an example of a CSS rule. Notice that we have three different attributes and values inside of this declaration block, but yet we still call it a rule. So we have our selector, and in this instance it's the HTML element body. It's followed by an open curly bracket, and then we have our attributes, which in this instance are font, family, color, background, and margin. Following the attribute's name, we have the value, and the value follows a colon. This is really important. Every attribute and value line has to be closed with a semicolon before we can go to the next attribution and name, or attribute name and value. And then once we're done with the declaration block, we close it out with a closing curly bracket. So let's keep going with this idea that everything is inside of an invisible box. Our HTML is inside of invisible boxes. So here we have a heading, and the heading element, the content for that is the cat's meow. We have 1, 2, 3 different paragraph tags, paragraph elements, and then we have doorway, which is in that first line of the first paragraph, has an emphasis tag around it. And then we have owner and we have keepers in the second paragraph, and those have some underline, something underlined. So boxes. Let's take a look at how this might be divided. So the entire thing has a box around it. The cat's meow is a H1 element, so there's a box around it. The first paragraph has a paragraph tag around it, so that is within another box. All of these boxes all appear on a new line. Now, when we get inside of the paragraph element, doorway is not on its own line. It doesn't start on the left. Doorway is an emphasis tag, and an emphasis tag is in line. So it starts and ends in between existing lines of text or existing lines of code. Same thing with owner and keeper. Those are in line with the other elements. They don't work like a individual block. So let's unpack that a little bit more. We have block level HTML elements and inline HTML elements. And we're going back to HTML so much right now because it's important to understand how we can control these elements with CSS and how they operate and how they their characteristics. So block level always appear on a new line. So that's what it looks like in a web browser. So those are things such as an H1 tag, paragraph, unordered list, the list items within that. They all appear on a new level. And so you can see in this graphic under block level, everything is pushed to the left. It doesn't continue where one element leaves off. Whereas we look at inline, those always appear to continue on the same line with their neighboring elements. So that'd be like an anchor tag, bold, an emphasis tag, an image tag. So we can see in the graphic, we have elements and they stop and start in line with their neighboring elements. All right, so grouping. So we have all these HTML elements, and remember we can use div as a container. And so a div is a way to group elements together. And no matter if those elements inside the div are block elements or inline elements, they will all appear as one block level box. Whereas a span, on the other hand, is used to contain a section of text or contain a number of inline elements. And spans are used so that we can control the text separately as a element within a line. Okay, so we've gone through all this. We've gone and talked about HTML just so that we can end up back with CSS. And here's a CSS box model. So we can use CSS to tell the box around our content to increase the padding, which is space between the content and our border. Border is, just like it sounds, it is a visible line around our padding and our content. And margin is the invisible space between our border and the other content, the other elements that are out there. So if you want space between two elements, you could increase the margin. So that's the box model. We're going to kind of move away from the discussion about everything's in a box, an invisible box, and containers, and we're going to move on to the inheritance. And so this is important because we have to know the selectors that we choose. So we remember back to the declaration block and the selector. The selector that we choose plays a role in all of our CSS. So a key concept for CSS is the ideal of inheritance. So if we dictate a rule for body that we want the text to be red, all of the text inside of our divs, our H1s, our articles, our paragraph tags, everything that is inside of the body tag, which is all of our visible content, will have red text. So let's go down a level. So let's say that I say that everything, my selector is the div ID content. So if we say that we want everything inside of div ID content to have blue text. Well, in this instance, in this diagram, we can see that once again, H1, div class article, H2, paragraph, block quotes, all of those elements are still under div ID content. So let's drop down to div class article. What if we had CSS rule that said div ID content would have blue text, but div class article would have red text? The H1 inside of div ID content would only have that rule apply to it. Since we use a selector that dictates div class article as our selector, and then our declaration block said that everything in that has blue text, H2, time, paragraph, block quote, and everything under that would be subjected to that rule. So thinking about what is the parent element and what are the descendants of that element are important when you're deciding what your selector is going to be for your CSS rules. So in that example, we had some conflicts. We said div ID content had one color, but div class article had a different color of text. So what happens when we have conflicting rules? So this is where the cascade comes into play. There's three principles that help us determine what to do and what wins out when we have conflicting rules. The first is the rule of specificity. So the more specific the selector, the stronger the rule. So if we say that we want only H3 elements that are inside of an article with a class of unicorn, that's a very specific rule. If we had a rule that said H3 elements are red, that's not very specific. And so the more specific the rule, the stronger the rule is, and it'll win out when compared to other rules. Okay, so next is order. And so remember, our browser reads code from top to bottom. And so in our CSS style sheet, if we have a rule that appears lower down on that list and it conflicts with one that is higher up on our code sheet, the latter one wins. The one that appears lower down on that list, on that sheet. And the reason is because the web browser reads from the top to the bottom. The last one is the rule of importance, and you can declare a rule important and it will supersede everything else, both specificity and order. That one will beat out everything else just because we have deemed it important. So just to wrap up, reference your textbook. There's some really great examples in there, but remember that CSS consists of selectors and a declaration block. The selector is an HTML element. It can also be a class or a ID that we have created. We can think of everything, all HTML elements, as inside of an invisible box, and there are block level items which all appear on a new line, and there are inline items, and those all appear within the same line, neighboring, in between neighboring CSS elements. So we can control all that, the content in it and the box around it. And an important thing to know is the box model. That consists of the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. Also important is to understand how cascading works, and inheritance is an important part of that. So knowing what a parent element is and a descendant of that element, and just choosing your selector accordingly. And then knowing the rules, the principles of what happens when you have conflicting rules. So specificity, order, and importance. So once again, reference a book if you need any clarification, and we'll see you for the next video.